Well, it's very unusual, Bev, for a minister to do anything in an official capacity other than campaigning, because the government is in caretaker mode, and under the caretaker conventions, the government can't take any new policy decisions or any new spending. So it really does suggest two things. First, that the government is deeply concerned that this is a crisis in the making. Second, that maybe the government should have done this earlier. It was weeks ago that the opposition urged the government publicly to send a minister to the Solomon Islands to try to deal with this problem. And the government's waited now, till now, in a campaign during a caretaker phase. It's just, I mean, it seems too little too late.
And of course now it's emerging that China in fact wanted to bring in weapons during the unrest last year. They wanted to even bring in a military squad. It's an indication that China feels that they have a right to that sort of activity because of the favours they've bestowed upon Solomon Islands.
That is written in the document from the Chinese embassy in the Solomon Islands, yes. It's justified as being in self-protection, self-defence for the embassy itself, not to be deployed outside the embassy, although they do reserve the right for this armed police or military squad, however you want to describe it, to leave the embassy and travel through the Solomon Islands on what they describe as escort duties. So it would essentially be giving free rein to a squad of people with pistols, rifles and 2 machine guns as well. Which is not part of the peacekeeping force, and as the Solomon Islands officials themselves note, would be setting a, quote, sad precedent, unquote, for diplomatic compounds and diplomatic conduct in the Solomon Islands. Now, this is just one element of the the Chinese presence in the Solomon Islands. The discussions to create a security and policing agreement which would allow regular and routine access and basing of Chinese armed forces in the Solomons is above and beyond this, and the potential for dual-use facilities in the Solomon Islands built by the Chinese, which would also allow civilian and military use, is yet a further step which is in prospect but not yet in negotiation. In other words, this is a classic piece of salami slicing or incremental advance that we've seen from the Chinese government for the last decade through the South China Sea, for example, the East China Sea, incremental, steady and unrelenting pressure to expand China's access and footprint.
Yet, you know, Scott Morrison today on the hustings made the point that they are a sovereign nation. So this last-minute dash to Solomons, are they likely to call off this pact as Australia is trying to get them to do?
It seems most unlikely. The Prime Minister, Sogavare, has already given assurances to Morrison, which Morrison's been quoting, that he will not allow any military basing in the Solomon Islands, and yet he's kept open the prospect of Chinese naval vessels visiting on a rotating basis. Sogavare was able to wield a fund to pay cash, this is all above board and legal in the Solomon system, to the MPs who voted in support of him to survive a recent no-confidence motion. The money for that fund is entirely supplied by the Chinese government. So he's in a position where his government, his prime ministership is supported out of a fund supplied from China. So you can see the influences being brought to bear there. Once again, Bev, this is an area where the Australian government, Scott Morrison, had the intellectual and policy awakening necessary to deal with Australia's growing strategic vulnerability through the Pacific Islands under Chinese pressure with his so-called Pacific step-up. Now, that was a good idea. The policy was right. The concept was correct. The follow-through has been inadequate. The results we are now seeing, and it's really been too little too late. There was a bipartisan parliamentary committee report last year in the Australian Parliament recommending that Australia look at not just the existing system of relations with the Pacific Islands nations, but also creating, as the Americans have in Micronesia with their affiliated states, compacts of free association, which would allow a whole new category of closer relations between Australia and Pacific Island states, where the citizens in those countries would get work access and possibly passports and many other closer arrangements possible to bring them more closely into the Australian orbit. The government has done nothing and not responded to that report. And that's just one of many examples where the government, in my view, has really been quite inert and complacent.
So could we see this become an issue during the campaign, given we've seen banners behind Anthony Albanese suggesting he is rather weak in this area?
Yes. Now, this is, as we've heard from everybody, including the heads of some of the intelligence agencies, that this is an artificial and unhelpful manufacturing of a difference where it doesn't exist. The Labor Party has been very careful to sign up to all the tenets of Morrison's China policy. And in fact, every piece of legislation that's gone through the Parliament related to foreign affairs and China policy, the Labor Party has supported and fulsomely. The Australia-China Research Institute, I'd also point out, which is an affiliate of the University of Technology, Sydney, put out, I think it was a 15 point-by-point comparison between Labor and coalition policy on China, and was unable to find any substantive difference. So this is a confected difference which doesn't exist in policy, but is nonetheless asserted by Scott Morrison on the basis of the territory theory of politics and campaigning, Bev, which is that it doesn't matter what's actually being said on the subject as long as the debate's being held on the territory of national security or economic management, the government wins. So Morrison will keep pushing in that direction to under the territory theory of policy, which both major parties happen to adhere to, and keep talking about it regardless of how based in fact or otherwise it might be.
More to come. Watch this space. We've still got another 5.5 weeks. Great to talk. Thanks, Pete.
Pleasure.